All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Adar Beis. To thank Leah Sol for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month in honor of all those who worked so hard to put together the groundbreaking. To thank our week of learning sponsors, an anonymous sponsor for the refuah sheleimah of Aharon Yosef ben Chana Miriam, and the zechus of a zivug for Rivka Rachael Batsheva Reena, and to thank Naftali Baila Langer for dedicating the week of learning as a zechus for the refuah sheleimah of Rachael Esther Feygã. Our day of learning sponsors, Mrs. Selma Woolf for the refuah sheleimah of Tinok ben Keshet Maya and Keshet Maya bas Naomi Gabriella. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, this mother and her baby will both have a complete and enduring refuah. Well, so with that, let us begin. So we have a beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is daf Tes 9. We are picking up Emir Hashem on Ches Amud Beis, and we left off at the 2 dots Gufa. So we have a lot to do today. Also, like to try to maybe get in a little bit of Inyane Hashkafa for Tinus Esther just at the end for the last few minutes. So Amir Hashem, let's begin. Gufa. So we are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 lines up from the bottom. Says the Gemara Gufa. So both say, remember again, revisiting part of our sugya from yesterday. Rebbe Omer, v'lakach ulekacha, v'yavam v'yibma. Remember again, Rebbe Darshan in yesterday's daf. This was on Ches Amud Aleph. Rebbe had his drasha that by the pasuk of Yibum, the Torah writes certain words, 2 words specifically, in an elongated form. Instead of saying v'lakach, it says v'lakcha. Instead of saying v'yavam or v'yibim, it says v'yibma. So Rebbe darshaned those elongated forms of the word in yesterday's daf. So the Gemara says, so Rebbe Omer, v'lakach v'lakcha v'yavam v'yibma le'eser tsaros v'arayos. And Rebbe understood that the elongated form here was here to go ahead and halacha l'maisa prohibit both tsaros and arayos, to go ahead and prohibit the arayos. Again, we had a whole discussion. Do you need a pasuk to prohibit arayos or not? But again, went ahead and prohibited arayos, and then also went ahead and prohibited tsaros, the co-wives. So says the Gemara. So first of all, how do you go ahead and see tsaros in there, right? Does the Torah make any mention of co-wives in that pasuk? That's number one. Va'od tsaros militzrar nafka. Further, we're going to both say tsaros are learned out from the word litzror. And litzror ultimately means what? Litzror halacha l'maisa refers to tsaros, tells you that anything that applies to the co-wives applies to the tsaros as well. To which the Gemara says, "Mapikli Rebbe l'chid Rabbi Shimon." To which the Gemara says, Rebbe uses litzror ultimately again like Rabbi Shimon. Okay, so we'll say that's the drasha. We'll see later on. So the Gemara says, "Hachaksiv tzara." What about tzara? Hachaksiv. Sorry. Again, the Gemara says tzara hachaksiv, but still, does the pasuk make any reference to tzara? In other words, how are you darshaning Sarah out of this pasuk? How are you dashing anything to do with co-wives out of this pasuk? The pasuk makes no reference to co-wives. This is what it means to say. Im kain lemakra v'lakach. If that's the case, that the Torah, this is what the pasuk means to say. Also, this is just a drush from yesterday. Im kain lemakra v'lakach. Torah could have just said v'lakach when speaking about the mitzvah of yibum. My v'lakcha. Why does the Torah use an elongated form and say v'lakcha? Kol hecha diika treli kuchin di bay nasif hai sharia v'ilo tarvayo asir. This is a fascinating drasha. So the fact that the Torah writes the elongated form v'lakcha instead of v'lakach, Rebbe darshans as follows: when is yibum possible? When is yibum possible? In a case where there are 2 widows, if you have the ability to marry either of the widows, then halacha l'maisa yibum is possible. And that's the elongated form of v'lakcha, when you could take, Rebbe's darshaning it essentially to mean when you could take them. So when the brother dies and he has 2 wives, if you're permitted to marry either of those 2 women, then yibum is possible. But the moment you are precluded from marrying any one of those women is the moment that what? Yibum becomes prohibited with both of them. That's v'lakcha. Great drasha. V'yibma. What does v'yibma mean? And what this goes back to yesterday's daf. B'makom yibum hu da'asira tzara. Shelo b'makom yibum shariat tzara. Ultimately, I will say v'yibma. What does v'yibma teach us? That Allah say the only time that the tzara of an erva is going to be aser is when b'makom mitzvah in a yibum context. But as we saw in yesterday's daf, the tzara of a yibum is not prohibited shelo b'makom mitzvah. I will say that was a very fine point that we discussed a number of times yesterday. Tzaras erba, the co-wife of an erba, is only prohibited to the man in a situation of mitzvah yibum, but in a non-mitzvah situation, halacha l'maisa, the co-wife of an erva is not prohibited. So I will say, this is the drasha of Rabbi. The lakcha, elongated form, teaches me when you could do yibum with either wife, then ultimately again you could do then there is a mitzvah of yibum. But if you're precluded from doing yibum with one of the women, then yibum becomes asur with the other one of the women as well. The yibma, elongated form of the yibma, teaches me the only time tzaras erva, the co-wife of an erva, is problematic is when b'makom mitzvah. Shelo b'makom mitzvah, meaning in a non-yibum context, the co-wife of an erva is not problematic. Good, Rabbi will say, that is the drasha of Rabbi. We'll say, I just want to point out, this secret to success of Yevamos, let me start by saying, I don't know what the secret to success is of Yevamos, right? I'll say, but an idea that I would like to put out there, I had a discussion with someone about this yesterday, is on each staff to try to remember the major nekudos, a couple of major points. That's why I try to do the review, right? To try to be more consistent with the review. It's just, so for example, this sheet of Rebbe, this is a point to hold on to because this is going to serve as a launching point for a couple of different pieces of the discussion. Again, it's hard in Yevamos to retain every single thing, especially when learning it Daf Yomi at the speed we have to go. But Lamaisa, again, a couple of ikr nekudos. The Gemara goes weiter. V'Rabbanan. So what do the Rabbanan? The Rabbanan who argue with Rebbe, what do they say? V'Rabbanan. Hai v'lakcha my avdilei. What do the Rabbanan do with v'lakcha? Right? What do they do with their prolonged form? So Bailahu l'chid Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. They use v'lakcha for Rabbi Yossi Chanina. What is Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina? V'lakcha. Rabbi Yossi is fascinating. Melamed shemegar shebeget umachzira. So let's listen to this. The Rabbanan. See, let's be clear. Everyone acknowledges that the Torah is writing these words v'lakcha and v'yibma in an elongated form. So once it's writing it in an elongated form, I have to ask myself, why? Well, what is it exactly that I'm being taught over here? So Rebbe has his drashas. Now the Rabbanan's drasha, listen to this. They say, v'lakcha, that teaches me, about this is fascinating, that halacha l'maisa, once a man does yibum, let's say he does yibum, and you know what, the marriage doesn't work out. What are his options? His options are the same options as any other marriage. He could divorce his wife. How does he divorce his wife? He gives her a get. So you'll say, what's the havamina? You might have thought that once you perform yibum, that's it. That's it. Or maybe that halacha l'maisa, chalitza is the way to exit that marriage. Kamash malon, no. Once you perform yibum, that yibum relationship morphs into a regular marriage. And the same way that a regular marriage is ended with a get, so too this yibum marriage is ended with a get as well. Not only that, we'll say, listen to this. What's the halacha if a man divorces his wife, and then they choose to reconcile and get remarried? Is that permitted? Yes, as long as what? The woman has not married anyone else in the interim. The same halacha applies to a yibum scenario, and this is fascinating. Let's say a man does yibum, okay, marriage doesn't work out, he gives her a get, then they decide to reconcile. The halacha is, the Rabbanan say he's permitted to remarry. The Rabbanan say, now what's the novelty in that? One might have thought, and logically so, that look, yibum to begin with, we've spoken so much about this, yibum to begin with is unique in that it allows an otherwise forbidden relationship. So one might have thought that, okay, you could do yibum, but if you decide to end that relationship, then what? It's done. Kamash malan, v'lakcha teaches me I could divorce the Yevamo with a get, and not only that, if we reconcile, I can remarry her. Fascinating. V'yibma, what does v'yibma teach me? Al karcha. So I'll say this is actually a fascinating concept that we'll discuss. What happens if the surviving brother violated his brother's widow? Right? So let's say the surviving brother went ahead and violated the Yevama. we're going to see that technically speaking, that affects Yibum, even though it's done to her against her will. We'll get into the mechanics of that in Mirz Hashem, but that's the Yevamos. So we'll say, so here's what we have, just to keep this in mind. Fundamental machlokes, here's what everybody agrees on. Lakcha, Yibma are written in prolonged form, therefore they're here for a drasha. According to Rebbe, the Lakcha teaches me, if you could do Yibum with both of them, then you could do Yib, then how mitzvah of Yibum applies. If you can't do Yibum with both of them, like for example in the case of an erva, then you can't do Yibum with either of them. Good, that's the Lakcha. The Yibma, Rebbe teaches us, Saras erva is only problematic b'makom mitzvah, in a Yibum situation. But the co-wife of an erva is permitted outside of a mitzvah situation. Rabbanon, the Lakcha, teaches me if I want to divorce the Yevama, I can do so with a get. And not only that, I can remarry her, as long as she didn't remarry anyone else in the interim. And the Yibma, ultimately Yibum works even against her will. Incredible. So we'll say that's the machlokes. So now, of course, you know what's going to happen. We're going to go back and forth and try to figure out how each opinion learns out the halachos from the other opinions' drashas. The Rebbe, where does Rebbe learn out the concept of Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, that halacha l'maisa, again, the ability to divorce the Yevama with a get and to remarry her, Meli'isha nafka. He learns it out from the pasuk that says Meli'isha. Both say the fact that the Torah says that the surviving brother takes his sister-in-law Li'isha as a wife indicates to us that all of the halachos of normative marriage apply to the Yibum relationship. So the Gemara says, Melishnafka al karcha. Where does he learn out the concept that Yibam could even work against her will? Me yivama yavo aleha. The fact that the Torah says that if the Yavam comes on to her, right, ultimately again indicates that halacha lamaisa, Yibam could take effect even if it's against her will. Good. Shabbos says, therefore, I give Rebbe, hi, v'hai aleha my avile. Shabbos say, again, no matter how much we think we've closed out the discussion of Aleha, we have not. So we're back, we'll say, to Gimel Amud Days. We're back to Gimel Amud Days. Right? The Aleha, ultimately, again, by Achos Isha, by wife's sister, ultimately, again, we're back to that. So what does Rebbe do with Aleha? So says the Gemara, my avile, mi baile lichidisanyo. Rebbe needs it actually for something totally different. Totally different. What does he need it for? What does he need it for? So the Gemara says, so we'll say this is fascinating because now, it's incredibly fascinating because now Rebbe is going to use this drasha for something totally unrelated. Not unrelated, but unrelated to what we've been discussing up until this point. So watch this. So says the Gemara, so I'll say, so now we're talking about as follows. If the Sanhedrin issues a psak halacha that's wrong, right? They could maybe issue an erroneous psak halacha, and the general populace acts based on that psak halacha. Okay, so there is a special carbon that they have to bring called a par he'elam davra minat tzibor, which literally means a par, which is a cow and ox, that is brought for something that was hidden or obscured from the tzibor. So this is the halach, this is the carbon they bring. Should they be responsible for delivering an erroneous psak halacha? So the Gemara says like this, the Rabbi says this, Beizin is not chayiv, ela al davar shezedono kares shegaso chatas. And I will say they're only liable to they bring this carbon if they paskin erroneously regarding something whose intentional commission is punishable by kares, and unintentional is punishable by a chata. So we'll say, to give you a good example of like this. Let's say the Beizin Paskin. We'll do this. Beizin Paskin, that you're allowed to marry your wife's sister. Right? You're allowed to eat on Yom Kippur. So these are things that if done intentionally, you're chayiv kares. If done unintentionally, you're chayiv chata. So Bezdin issued an erroneous ruling in this type of context, then halacha l'maisa they have to bring a par halam davar minat tzibor. V'chein hamashiach. So to the Mashiach. I will say, who's the Mashiach? Halavai, we should find out soon. But in Hashem, but in this context, this is referring, of course, to the Kohen Mashiach, right? To the Kohen. So the Gemara says, "V'lo." I'm sorry, V'chema Mashiach. Good. So top of test. V'lo ba'avodas kochavim. And when it comes to matters of idolatry, right? Rabbi say. So let's say the tzibor went ahead and inadvertently worshipped idolatry. So Rabbi say we're going to see that for inadvertent worship of idolatry, if the tzibor, if the congregation did this, they have to bring a par for an olah and a seir, a goat, as a chatos. So it says, Ella al davar shechayaven al zadono kares v'shigagaso chatos. So remember again. So there's two things happening over here. There is the halacha when it comes to the Beis Din, right? So if the Beis Din issues an erroneous ruling, or the Kohen Mashiach, the Kohen Gadol goes ahead and issues an erroneous ruling. If they permit something whose intentional commission is kares and unintentional commission is a chatos, then they have to bring their unique karbanos. Par helam davar min hatzibor, par Kohen Mashiach. Similarly, if the tzibor, the congregation, worships idolatry, and worships in a way where intentional commission would have been kares and unintentional chatos, in that case the tzibor will go ahead and bring a par for an olah and the seir for a chatos. Good. So I'll say, the Gemara says, Utnanami, we learned, Kol mitzvah sheba Torah.
30 seconds. Fast. 30 seconds.
There's a lot of pressure. All right. Good. So it says the Gemara, Utnanami. Kol mitzvah sheba Torah, shechayav nas dono kares, v'al shir gaso chatos. Never ends well when you gulp coffee like that. It's good. So Gemara says like this. Utnanami, we learned, Kol mitzvah sheba Torah. So therefore, again, these are just two different halachic constructs. On one hand, you have, again, Kohen Mashiach, right? The Kohen Gadol issues an erroneous ruling. Beis Din issues an erroneous ruling. So the Bryce is saying that halacha l'maisa, they each bring their respective karbanos, but the only time that there's liability for them is in a case where halacha l'maisa, they issued an erroneous ruling regarding something which, if committed intentionally, is a chiyuv chatos, intentionally chiyuv kares, unintentionally chiyuv chatos. Okay? That's the common denominator. Similarly, if the tzibor inadvertently worships idolatry, they have to bring a par as an olah and a seir as a chatos, but again, that's only in a situation where they worshipped in a way where, if done intentionally, would have been chayiv kares, unintentionally chayiv chatos. Okay? Keep this in mind. Utnanami, we learned, furthermore, we learned that what? Any mitzvah in the Torah really means any aver in the Torah, if you did intentionally would be chayiv kares, and unintentionally chatos, yochid mevi kisba o seira. Shavuot says, so this is not talking about, in general, an individual's committing an avera. And it's the type of avera which, if done intentionally, is a chiyuv kares, unintentionally is a chiyuv chatos. If an individual commits the avera, yochid mevi kisba, an individual will bring a sheep, o seira, or a goat, a female goat, right? Nasi mevi seir. A nasi, right? If the nasi was the head of the Jewish people, he'll bring a seir, right? That could be the melech, right? The king will bring a seir. Mashiach ubeis din meviin par. And ultimately, again, if it's the Mashiach, right? The Kohen Mashiach, the Kohen Gadol, or the Beis Din, they bring a par. Ba'avodas kochavim. What about, again, if halacha l'maisa, there was the inadvertent worship of idolatry? So it depends who does it. Yochid, Nasi, Umashiach. So if it's an individual, the king or the Kohen Gadol, Meviin Seira, they bring a female goat. Sibor, Meviin Par, right, the Soyer. So the Sibor, if they did it, will bring a par and the Soyer. Par li Ola Usiir Lachatos. Good, so both say, this is pretty much just a beautiful halacha. I mean, it's not beautiful. It's a beautiful because it's halacha, but it's talking about, again, the different levels of carbonic liability. We start out by talking about liability for erroneous rulings. then liability, ultimately, again, if the tzibor worships idolatry, and then we transition into, again, personal liability. In the case of the Nasi, the case of the Mashiach, the Kohen Mashiach, the case of a regular Yachid, and the case of a tzibor. To which the Gemara says, fine, Minani from where do we know this? Where do we know this? The Tanah Abanon, V'noda hachatos asher chatu aleha. So we'll say the pasuk says, and they will know, and the tzibor will know, right? V'nodu achatas asher chatu aleha ve'krivu kahal. So we'll say this is talking about a situation of halacha l'maisa where the kahal worships idolatry. So the Gemara says, and they will know the chatos asher chatu aleha. They will come to know the chet, the sin that they sinned aleha, about it. So we'll say, now watch this. Here we go. But let's remember again, why are we doing this now? Right? Like, what does it have to do with anything? Remember, I will say, we just had an incredible machlokes, Rebbe and the Rabbanon, about how to darshan v'lakcha v'yibma. At the end of that, what did the Gemara say? By the way, Rebbe, what do you do with what? What do you do with what? Aleha. Aleha by achos isha. Here we go. We'll say, so watch this. Rebbe Omer, ne'emar kan aleha. Both say it says over here. This is incredible. It says over here when it comes to inadvertent worship of idolatry, aleha v'ne'emar lehalon aleha, and it says by achos isha aleha ma lehalon davar shechayaven al zadon kares al shigagos al chatos afkan davar shechayaven al zadon kares va'al shigagos al chatos. Wow. I will say. So listen to this. There's a gzeira shava. This is wild. There's a gzeira shava, ultimately, again, between communal inadvertent worship of idolatry and the prohibition, to marry one's wife's sister. Wow. And therefore, Rebbe says like this, just like by achos isha, Rebbe will say, what's the halacha? Achos isha, if a person intentionally marries his wife's sister, it's a chi of kares, and if he inadvertently has relations with her, then what? Then Allah L'maisa it's a chi of chatos. So too Rebbe says, when is the tzibor chayiv, right, to go out and bring their karbanos for inadvertent worship of idolatry? When they worshipped in a way that had it been done intentionally, there'd be a chi of kares, and unintentionally a chi of chatos. Rebbe say, now, in idolatry, how do you make a distinction between that which is chayiv for kares and chat? Look at Rashi. Second Rashi from the top. So we'll say, for example, so offering up a carbon to idolatry, burning ketoras, incense, nisuch, going ahead and wine libations, or bowing down. So we'll say those are all things that if done for idolatry, if you do it intentionally, it's a chi of kares. Aval mechabek umenashek lo. We'll say, for example, if you kiss an idol or you hug an idol, even if you did that intentionally, interestingly enough, that's not a chi of kares. Or as to say it differently, the only time that there is a chi of kares for intentional violation of worship of avodah zarah is when you worship avodah zarah in the same way that what? We worship Hashem. Or you do avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. But if you kiss an idol, even if your intention ultimately is for idolatry, that would not be a chi of kares. Fine. So we'll say, so ultimately again, so where does Rebbe know, this is fascinating, where does Rebbe know that halacha l'maisa, the only time that tzibor is chayiv to bring their unique karbanos for communal worship of idolatry is in a case where they worshipped in a way that had it been done intentionally, there would be a chi of kares, and unintentionally chi of chatos, gzeira shava, aleha, from karbanos to achos isha, to wife's sister. Just like a wife's sister, intentionally chi of kares, unintentionally chi of chatos, so too by communal worship of avodah zarah. Incredible. Ashkechon tzibor. So fine. So now you made a gzeira shava to the tzibor. Mashiach miralan. How do you know about the Kohen Mashiach and about the Kohen Gadol? Says the Gemara, "T'chsev b'Mashiach li ashmas ha'am." Ultimately, again, the Torah says by the Mashiach, it says that the Mashiach is treated like ashmas ha'am. But say ashmas ha'am means like the iniquity of the people. So what do you see from here? Hari Mashiach et tzibor. Ultimately, the Torah itself compares the Kohen Gadol to the tzibor. So whatever is true for the tzibor will be true for the Kohen Gadol. To which the Gemara says, Yochid v'nasi. Okay, how do I know about liability for individual, just an individual and the nasi? Asya mitzos. To make a gzeira shava, ultimately again a mitzos. Beautiful. So I'll say, so therefore again, v'lo Velo ba'avodos kochavim ela adar shechiyavin al zdona kares al shigos achatas. We'll say, so again, I just want to point out, now of course you know what's going to happen. So we'll say, so now that we all we wanted to know, by the way, is what Rebbe does with Aleha. So we'll say, what does Rebbe do with Aleha? What does he do with it? Gezer Shava, from Achos Isha to communal worship of Avodah Zarah. That's the answer to the question. But of course, once we open this door, right? Once we open this door, so we're going to continue to go down this path a little bit more. So it says the Gemara, V'lo ba'avodas kochavim, and remember again, about say when it comes to Beis Din's liability for erroneous rulings. So let's say they permitted something with Avodah Zarah, they're only going to be chayiv par helam davar min hatzibur when ela al davar shechayavin al zadona kares v'ashigaso chatos. Only for something, again, which if done intentionally, would have the chiyuv kares, unintentionally chiyuv chatos. Tzibor, ba'avodos kochavim. I will say, what about the tzibor? When it comes to the communal worship of Avodah Zarah, yolif me'ene ene. Gzer shavav ene ene. Yochid nasi umashiach. What about Rabbi say? So again, we're not gonna delve too much into all of these drashas. The Gemara is just working this all through. Yochid nasi umashiach. What about the individual, the king and the kohen gadol? Mevi'im nefesh achos. So we'll say echad yochid ve'echad nasi ve'echad mashiach b'mashma. Ultimately, again, that comes to include both a liability for an individual, the the king, and the kohen gadol. Vav mosif al inyan rishon v'yilamed tachton mina elyon. So we'll say because there is a vav mosif, which is an additional vav. The vav ultimately again adds on to that which was stated earlier, and ultimately tells that you can learn out that which was stated later from that which was stated earlier. Good. We'll say that concludes the Rebbe piece. So we'll say now I know what Rebbe does. So I'll say again. Here's what you need to remember. Machlokes Rebbe Rabbanon, just keep the flow. Machlokes Rebbe Rabbanon, Aharon darshan v'lakchav v'yibma. Rebbe has his approach, Rabbanon has their approach. What does Rebbe do with Aleha? Rebbe learns out Aleha, ultimately again to communal worship of Avodah Zarah. Just like Achos Isha is a situation where intentional violation kares, unintentional violation chatos, so too, when is the tzibor chayiv? Their unique karbanos for communal Avodah Zarah worship, when they did something that had it been done intentionally would be a chiyuv kares, unintentionally is a chiyuv chatos. Beautiful. That's it. Now, the Rabbanon, so I'll say, now remember again, the Rabbanon darshin aleha, here now of course they have a problem. Right, what's our problem? The Rabbanon ultimately again use aleha for yibum. Right? They use the pasuk of Aleha for Yibum as we spoke about before. So we'll say, now what's the shayla? Where do they learn out that halacha l'maisa, chatos is only brought for something that if, for an infraction that if done intentionally is a chiyuv kares, and unintentionally creates a chiyuv chatos. So in other words, where do the all this stuff we just learned before, where do the Rabbanon learn all of this out from? So watch this. So Rabbanon hay svara min alahu. Where do the Rabbanon learn out that a chatos only comes in a situation where for an avera, which if done intentionally would warrant a chiyuv kares? Where do they learn that from? So min alahu nafkaluhu midemikri le Rabbi Yoshua lebrei. So I said, listen to this. They learn this out from that which Rabbi Yoshua said to his son. Torah says, Torah achos Yihiyah lachem la'oseh b'shkaga. Torah says you have one law for everyone who commits an aveira unintentionally. V'nefesh asher taseh biyad rama, and for the person who goes ahead and commits an aveira intentionally. Huksha kala Torah kula la'avodos kochavim. So we'll say, now here's what's interesting. The pasuk over here, the context of the pasuk is talking about a situation where halacha l'maisa, the tzibur commits an avera, or specifically again, tzibur worships idolatry. So the Torah says, Torah achos, there will be one law for the person who commits an avera unintentionally, and the person who goes ahead and commits an avera intentionally, v'nichra sanefesh ahi, person will experience kares. So both say, the subject over here is avodah zarah, but look at the lashon the Torah uses in talking about avodah zarah. It says, Torah achos, there will be one law. And what do we learn from here? The Torah compares all of the mitzvahs or all of the averos in the Torah to idolatry. Ma avodas kochavim davar shechayav and azdon akaris ashir gasol chatos. Just like Rabbi said, when it comes to idolatry, you're only chayiv if you do something whose intentional violation will be chayiv karis. If you commit that same act unintentionally, you're chayiv chatos. Af kol davar shechayav and azdon akaris ashir gasol chatos. So Rabbi said, this is incredible. The Rabbanan say, Kala Torah Kula is learned out from Avodah Zarah. Just like Avodah Zarah, there's only chatas liability if you do something that whose intentional violation has a chiyuv kares. Then if you do it unintentionally, bring a chatas. That becomes the paradigm for Kala Torah Kula. Anytime I violate an avera, which had I done it intentionally, would have a chiyuv kares. If I do it unintentionally, carries with it a chiyuv chatos. Beautiful. Ashkechon yochid v'nasi u'mashiach. So we'll say that covers an individual, the king and the kohen gadol. Bein avodas kochavim, bein b'shar mitzvos. That right, whether it's idolatry or all other mitzvos. Tzibor ba'avodas kochavim minayin. How do I know what that halacha is when it comes to the tzibor and communal worship of idolatry? Amakra, the pasuk says, v'im nefesh. Pasuk says, if nefesh, they will say nefesh covers who? Bepashtos nefesh covers everyone. The yomot al yon mitachton. And ultimately, again, we can learn out that which was discussed earlier from that which was discussed later. So we can learn out tzibor, which was earlier from that which was discussed later. Elet tzibor b'shar mitzvos minalan. Rather, I will say the shaila is tzibor in general, even outside of idolatry. How do I know that if the tzibor violated an avera, whose intentional commission would be a chiyuv kares, that if they did it unintentionally, they're chay b'chatos? Yolif me'einem me'einaim. So I will say they learn out from the Gzera Shava. The Rebbe. So we'll say, so now we have where, how the Rabbanon learn out the chiyuv chatos for kares bearing infractions. Now we're switching back to Rebbe. The Rebbe, hi Torah achos my avidle. Rebbe, what does Rebbe do with the drush of Torah achos? To which the Gemara says, mi baile l'chidisanya. Here I say he needs it as follows. Watch this. We'll say this is fascinating. The Torah makes a distinction, ultimately again, between individuals who worship idolatry and a rabbin. I will say now, what do we call it when a rabbin, when a community worships idolatry? Rashi tells us, Ir Nidachos. That is a city which worshipped idolatry, a condemned city. What's the halacha? Listen to this. Yechidim, so the Gemara says, Yechidim beskila. So I will say Yechidim, when they chas v'shalom worship idolatry intentionally, are put to death by stoning, by skila. And I will say skila is considered to be the most severe form of execution. So listen to this. So Yechidim beskila, lefichach mamonan palat. I will say because they're executed in the most severe way, their possessions are spared. It's almost as if there's like a balance over here. If you have the most severe form of execution, so the Torah kind of takes it easy on your possessions. Merubim b'sayif, but let's see, in Ir Nidachos, if the community goes ahead and worships idolatry, they are put to death by the sword, which is considered to be a more kal form, right? The more lenient form of execution. Ultimately, the fichach mamonan of it. I will say, what do you do with the possessions of an Ir Nidachos? What do you do with it? You destroy it. Lefichach mamonam avad. Yachal nachlok b'karbonosein. You might have thought that therefore again, because their executions are different, that therefore again, ultimately their karbonos should be different as well. Talmud lomar, Torah achos yelochem. Therefore we'll say, what does the pasuk say? According to Rebbe, Torah achos, it will be one Torah, one halakha, you bring the same karbonos. Incredible. So we'll say that's what Rebbe does with Torah achos. So the Rabbanan use Torah achos to teach you the paradigm. What's the paradigm? Anytime you violate a kares bearing avera, ultimately again unintentional commission of that same act will yield the chiyuv chatos. Rebbe says no. It comes to teach me that although the punishments for idolatry are different depending on who worships, the karbanos are always the same. Maskef Rabbi Chilkiah me'agronya tamed dekasav rachmana Torah achos yelochem. The reason ultimately this is true is because it's Torah achos. Halav hachi hava mina nachlok. So apparently, according to Rebbe, had the Torah not said Torah achos, you might have thought what? that different people should have different karbanos, or different, like, a city, an Nidachos, should have one carbon. An individual should have a different carbon for inadvertent commission. So the Gemara said, well, how would that work? My lesu. So ultimately, again, what should the tzibur bring? Lesu par. So if you would say, ultimately, again, they would bring lesu. In other words, what should how would you be mechalik in the karbanos? If you say that he brings a par, tzibur b'shar mitzvos hu demaisu kisba. I'm sorry. So the Gemara says, my laisu par, tzibor b'shar mitzvos hu demaisu. Remember again, the tzibor brings the par if they go ahead and they inadvertently violate other mitzvos. So the Gemara says, kisba. Maybe you'll say ultimately a female sheep. Yachid b'shar mitzvos hu demaisi. An individual brings a kisba for other infractions. Sayer, maybe it's a goat. Nasi b'shar mitzvos hu demaisi. A nasi brings that by other mitzvos. Par, the ola usir lechatos. Maybe it's a par for an ola nasir lechatos. Tzibur ba'avodas kol chavim hu demaisi. A tzibur already brings that for their infractions. Ve'elamai. I will say, what do you have to say? What do they bring? A seira, a female goat. Yachid nami hainu karbano. But that's also the karban of a yachid. So it turns out that anyway, the tzibur is bringing the same thing as a yachid. To which the Gemara says, it's trich. I'll tell you why it's needed. I might have thought, Hawil v'tzibor b'hora maisu par the ola osir lechatos. Since Rabbi said in a case, ultimately again, where the tzibor received erroneous instruction, they bring, and they act on it, they bring a par for ola and osir lechatos. Inhu nami naisu. Perhaps the individual should also bring that. Therefore, we'll say the Gemara says, Inhu nami naisu ipcha. Perhaps the individual should bring just the opposite. Inami tzarech ve'in lo takana. Or I thought he has to bring a different carbon, but there is no remedy for him. Kamash malon no. Kamash malon that alocha lamaisa. That tzibor actually brings the same carbon as the yachid. Good. Amrali Levi the Rebbe. So both say, so fine. Now both say, we have how everybody's darshaning everything. Beautiful. Amrali Levi the Rebbe. My area ditani Tesla. So I'll say, now we're going back to the Mishnah. Both say, so by the way, it appears that now we have officially closed out the sugya of Aleha. Right? Yeah, that's what it appears, right? We've essentially explained how everyone and their brother, right? Everyone and their brother has darshan Aleha. Supposed to say, the Gemara has a different question. Amar Levi the Rebbe. My area ditani tesvav. Why does the Mishnah only mention 15 cases? Also, going back to our Mishnah. Why does the Mishnah mention 15 cases of women who are exempt from Yibum and also exempt their co-wives? Listni tes zayin. Why not go ahead and mention 16? Who are the 16? So we'll say we'll discuss in just a moment. So the Gemara says, Amalei kimudumali she'in moach bekad kado. So we'll say this is pretty strong, right? So Levi says to Rebbe, I don't understand why halacha l'maisa the Mishnah only mentioned 15 cases. There should really be 16 cases. To which Rebbe says, it appears that you have no brain in your head. Okay, which means the Gemara says, "My daitech." Why? What are you assuming should be the 16th case? So Isa the Gemara says, "Imo anusas aviv." I know what you're thinking. You're thinking about the following case. We'll say, here's the case. Let's say again you have Reuven and Shimon. And again, what happens? Their father, Yaakov, violates a woman. Right? Well, before you have Reuven and Shimon. Yaakov violates a woman. As a result of that act of violation, ultimately, again, they have a son, Reuven. They're not married, right? Obviously, right? Yaakov violates a woman, they're not married. Good. So they have a son, Reuven. Reuven has a brother, Shimon. Right? They have the same father, different mothers. What ends up happening now? Shimon marries the woman who his father violated. Anusas aviv. Right now, both say we already went through this sugya and we explained that halacha l'maisa. So we paskin, you're not allowed to marry your father's wife, but you can marry a woman who was violated by your father. So now both say, so Shimon marries the woman violated by his father, who also happens to be what? His brother's mother. Hanukkah parties are very interesting. I just want to point it out, right? Who also happens to be his brother's mother, right? So Shimon marries the woman violated by his father, right? Who also happens to be Reuven's mother. Now what happens? Shimon passes away without children. Remember again, the mitzvah of Yevamos has nothing to do with whether or not the woman has children, right? Obviously in this case, the woman, right, the widow has children, right? Her son's name is Ruvain, who also happens to be now the man who stands to do yibum with her. Right? So Shimon passes away, leaves behind his widow. So now you have a situation of Ruvain having to do yibum, well, Ruvain, technically speaking, being the yavam with his mother. So the Bo says, obviously, Yibum can't happen in that situation. So what Levi was asking was, why don't we include that case? Right? That seems to be a good case. To which the Gemara says, Anusas, so, Ma'idetech imo anusas aviv pluktet Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanan. Supposed to listen to this very quickly. So ultimately, again, the case of Anusas of Rabbi is actually a machlokes case. It's a machlokes case, and ultimately, Rabbi say, and this has to do again. We'll just call it for now. It's a machlokes case. Ubeplukta lo kamairi. Rabbi say the Mishnah does not include any cases subject to machlokes. The 15 cases of the Mishnah are meant to be cases that everyone agrees with. So the Gemara says, "Velo, is that true? That there are no machlokes cases in the Mishnah? V'hari isser mitzvah, v'isser kedusha, the pligi Rabbi Kiva v'Rabbanan." Ultimately, I will say there's the case of isser mitzvah and the case of isser kedusha. So we're going to see isser mitzvah refers to cases of rabbinic arayos, women who are not arayos de oraisa, but only arayos de rabbanon. Those are cases of what we call isser mitzvah and isser kedusha. Isser kedusha both are cases, for example, where the man can't marry the woman because of kedusha case. For example, mamzeres. Let's say the surviving sister-in-law is a mamzeres. So those are cases, we'll see that. Those are cases that are subject to machlokes. Yet again, the pligiba Rabbi Kiva Rabban and the katani. And ultimately they're stated in a later Mishnah, to which the Gemara says, you're right, bepirkin kaminon. We're talking about an our parak. In our parak, we don't like to include any cases that are subject to machlokes. So ultimately, the Gemara say, but yet, even in our Mishnah, Beis Shammai says, sorrows of an erva are permitted. And Beis Hillel says they're not. This is incredible. Beis Shammai b'makom Beis Hillel eina Mishnah. I will say when Beis Shammai disagrees with Beis Hillel, it's like there's not even a machlokes. I will say this is very strong. First you've got Rebbe. You've got Rebbe saying to Levi, you don't even have a brain in your head, which we have to discuss. Right? We have ultimately again the Gemara saying when there's machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, it's as if Beis Shammai doesn't even exist. I will say, what about the case of the brother who was never alive at the same time as his now deceased brother? Remember again, that's the case of Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven passes away, leaves right without children, right? And then what happens after Reuven passes away? A third brother is born, Levi. That case, Amud Beis, the pligi, Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanan. That's the case of Machlokes Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanan. Vikatani. Vikatani, and I will say ultimately again that's included in the Mishnah. So you see, the Mishnah does include machlokes cases, to which the Gemara says benolad ulabasof yivim lo pligi Rabbi Shimon. Ultimately, again I will say, in the case of nolad ulabasof yavam, in the case of where Levi was born before Shimon did yibum. Ultimately, again, there's no machlokes in that case, and that's the case of the Mishnah. Aharon Yosef says Rabbi Shimon did disagree even in that first case. So says Rabbi So listen to this. Rabbi Chia espouses a principle over here. And I will say, what's the principle of Rabbi Chia? I will say, I'm just going to read this quickly. I will say, just because it's already 6:30, so I'm going to spend one more minute on this. I will say, I'm just going to tell you what we're going to do with this Gemara. This Gemara, which appears on Chaf Vav 26, opens up a whole new discussion with a whole bunch of complicated cases. We are not going to delve into the cases over here. We're going to delve into the cases when we get to Chaf Vav, but I just want to read, we're going to go through this Gemara right now. We're going to do this at times in Yevamos. There are times we're just going to accept the fact that we're not going to delve head first into the cases because we're going to come to them later. One of these situations. We'll say quickly. Rabbi says in all of these cases, I apply the following principle. Ha'asur lazeh, mutaris lazeh. That which is asr, or she which is asr to this brother, could be permitted to a different brother. V'asur lazeh, mutaris lazeh. And one who is asr to this brother could be mutter to this brother. V'achos shehi yevinta, choletzes omis yavemes. And ultimately, again, a sister who is also a Yevama, does chalitza and does not go ahead and do yibum. What is this talking about? Rabbi Yehuda Metargem mechamosa ve'elach. Rabbi Yehuda says this principle only applies to the cases of mother-in-law and on in our Mishnah. Aval shisa babi derei, but for the first 6 cases of the Mishnah, it does not apply. My timer, what's the reason? Kevan debito ba'onsin mishkachas la, benisuin lo mishkachas la, benisuin kamari ba'onsin lo kamari. Because ultimately he will say that Mishnah is only applying to cases of marriage, not to cases that are a result of violation. Abaye explains, Af bito me'anasuso. Abaye says the principle could even apply to a daughter who's a result of a violation. Kevan dashkuchi mishkachas la, ibaya minanusin, ibaya minanusin tihavi, ibaya minanisuin tihavi. Because he holds that the Mishnah's cases can be both cases of marital law as well as cases where the woman was violated. Aval ishes achiv shleimah ba'olamo lo. But in a case ultimately again of a brother who was not born at the same time as his now deceased brother, doesn't apply. My timer. Since that case is subject to machloges, ultimately again we do not go ahead and include it. Rav Safra says it can even apply to a case our brother was not born at the time of his now deceased brother. And that can come up in the case of 6 brothers. And I'll say another case that we are not getting into right now. And ultimately again this goes according to Rabbi Shimon, top of Yud. We're really covering good ground today. V'simalech, meis nolad v'yabam, meis nolad v'yavam. The way to remember this ultimately again is it only works in a case of where the brother passed away, then ultimately again the new brother was born, then yibum occurred. Ella l'Rebbe hani klal lesle. Rather, Rabbi said the bottom line is according to Rebbe, the klal as espoused by Rabbi Chia, the third line down from Amud Beis, does not apply. I will say, just to kind of bring that together, my apologies for the speed at the end of Amud Beis, I will say is again, we're going to see all of these Gemaras. These Gemaras actually, they don't belong here. They belong on Chaf Vav. The Gemara is quoting them as in totally secondary fashion. We'll see them on Chaf Vav. Rabbi will say again, the parts to remember, I'll record the Chazara today, but just so you understand how we got to this last part, Rabbi will say all we were just trying to figure out is why the Mishnah only includes 15 cases, why doesn't it include the 16th case? So ultimately again, the case of Anusas Aviv, to which the Gemara wanted to say essentially the bottom line is, we're only including cases in the Mishnah that are not subject to dispute. Everyone agrees on the 15 cases here. The dispute cases will Amir Hashem come about a little bit later on. I will say, Shkoyach. Amen.